Hello, everyone. I hope you are all doing really well today. And it is Tuesday, noon Eastern time. And I am Elizabeth Corey. I'm the founder of beatingtrauma.com. And today we're going to talk about trauma recovery, not surprisingly. But specifically, I want to talk a little bit about relationship and isolation and how that plays into our healing process, because there's a lot of viewpoints out there. A lot of people have a lot to say about where relationship and isolation kind of play into our healing and what that looks like. So I want to give you some perspectives on that, and maybe it will be something that will help you as you try to figure out how that's going to play out for you. Because there's a lot of people with a lot of opinions. And when I say a lot of people with a lot of opinions, I mean people who like teach this stuff, train this stuff. Like they're trauma specialists or they're coaches and things like that. And they're out there saying the only way to heal is this way or the only way to heal is that way. And so it can get pretty extreme at times, and it can be hard to find the balance, but I can promise you, much like anything else, the real healing happens when we do find that balance and when we can see the benefits, but also see how we may be stopping ourselves from growing as fully as we want to because of expectations that we have heard over the years from society, from others, from coaches, from ourselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And this conversation that I'm having today was actually spurred on by a conversation I had with my client where she was following a coach, somebody I respect a tremendous amount. I'm not going to get into names and stuff. I love what he has to say a lot of the times, but he was saying something like the only way to truly heal is in relationship. And my client implied that meant intimate relationships. I want to be very clear that there is a big difference. And I'm going to kind of talk about it from the standpoint of intimate relationships more so today than other types of relationships, but really balancing out our relationship and isolation is very important no matter what kind of relationship it is. Okay. So, gonna start off, as I said, we have these extreme views about both relationship and isolation. Many times people will say, well, if you're in isolation, you're hiding, you're not healing, you're avoiding, you're gonna be stuck. When in fact, that isn't necessarily the case. As a matter of fact, there is a certain amount of isolation that is actually needed for us to heal, especially when we have had the kinds of relational trauma that make it very difficult for us to focus on ourselves when other people are around. Self-erasure, as I like to call it, can be pretty significant after relational trauma, especially a complex trauma, right? So if we're erasing ourselves when we're in relationship, there is some level of isolation that must be a part of our healing process. Now, believe me, we're going to have a lot of resistance to that because we've already discovered that outside of relationship, we don't know who we are and we don't want to have to face that. So if we're focusing on other people, that kind of keeps us away from having to deal with who we are, because we can just continue to mirror others and be what they need us to be. And I'll be honest, sometimes, especially to certain inner parts, that feels safer and easier. I mean, it may actually be easier for a while, not in the long term, but in the short term, it may in fact actually be a bit easier to continue to mirror others and to not face ourselves in isolation. But I want to be clear, what I'm talking about today is finding a balance between relationship and isolation and finding the right relationships that keep us moving forward in recovery. Those are extremely important parts of our healing journey. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about what kind of relationships are not moving us forward in recovery, because it's important to question the notion that healing only happens in relationship. I actually don't believe that's true. And there's a lot of There's a beliefs out there, societal beliefs that really push that view. There's also a lot of privilege that is often involved when people say that. And I also want to talk about that. So I'm going to give you some different perspectives about why we have to be careful making statements like that. Because honestly, that can be problematic for our healing. It really can. It can actually even stall us out, as I said, because we're mirroring others. But there's other reasons too, and I'm going to talk about those now. First of all, I'm going to start by saying that oftentimes when people talk about relationship, like intimate relationships especially, and they say things like, well, what's the worst that can happen? You might get triggered, right? Or you might end up like brokenhearted because it doesn't work out. Or, you might see this relationship reflected somehow, in your life in a way that makes you uncomfortable. And most people would say, well, those may be actually growth catalysts for us. We need those things to happen. The problem is that's not the worst thing that can happen. And sometimes when there are, especially men saying you have to heal in relationship, what's the worst that can happen? What gets left out there is the idea of physical safety being assumed in relationships. Okay. For many of us, and especially women who have been through pretty severe levels of physical and sexual trauma, being in a relationship isn't as simple as maybe having our hearts broken. Being in a relationship may pose to us a significant physical or sexual traumatic threat. Okay. So I want to be very clear about this. This does tend to be a privilege issue. A lot of times we're going to hear this coming from men who maybe, yes, believe me, I do understand that plenty of men actually experience physical and sexual trauma in relationship. But for those that don't, they can take this perspective. And so I want us to really consider the fact that that's a bit of a privileged statement. And it may be that in order for many women to establish safety in their life, it may need to happen without a significant relationship with a male. And by significant, I mean like an intimate or co-living situation, right? So I'm going to be very clear about this. This is important for those of us with complex trauma because a lot of times when we hear coaches talking about relationship, they're not taking into account some of the more extreme complex traumas that we are often talking about here, right? They're talking about traumas that are maybe not quite so far on that continuum of extreme, right? That we are often talking about. So we have to consider that. And that sort of brings me into this next one, which is also a privilege, which is lack of severe relational trauma, right? So that's what I'm talking about here. Many times when people say you need to heal in relationship, they are expecting that there will be some basic level of relational functioning. Okay. And that relational functioning can happen without being triggered into significant dissociation. Okay. That isn't necessarily true. Okay. So when we're in relationships and we have significant relational trauma, the trauma patterns that play out in those relationships will often bring us into a significant state of dissociation. Okay. It may mean that we lose time, but for sure, it means that we're going to be in some of our old patterns and we're probably not going to see it. Okay. When we're in that situation, we are not healing. Okay. We are becoming re-traumatized, right? And that is a problem. And we need to give ourselves space to recognize that there may be a time in our lives where isolation is required to heal, because if we don't have safety, and if our relationships can't provide safety because we are repeating our old, quite violent patterns, we need to do our healing without those. I talked about privilege. Now, some of the belief systems that may be impacting others when they tell us things about healing in relationship, one of those is societal, right? And it is that there is a lack of worthiness if you're not in relationship. Relationship is actually what defines your worthiness as a person. Okay. And that's something we really have to start to question more and more. I mean, we hear it everywhere. We hear it everywhere. Society, families, all over the place, that people are only worthy if there is somebody else who loves them and can show them their worthiness through that love, right? That is inaccurate, but it is often a belief that really pushes people to promote the idea of being in relationship. Another belief, which often applies more to women than it does to men, but it can be both, is beliefs about not being able to live independently. Of course, there is an overall societal belief, right, that is more geared towards not living independently if you're a woman. But then within families, both men and women can experience within families this notion that they'll never survive without the family. At the very least, they will not survive on their own, right? So this becomes a belief that gets really ingrained. And this goes all the way back to humans in tribal form, right? When we were hunting and gathering in groups and that was the only way we could ensure our safety and survival, absolutely, we needed those relationships. They were actually necessary for our survival. We don't live in that kind of world now. And it's one of the reasons probably that more people are able to move towards safety and healing than have, in my opinion, ever before, right? So that's something to consider. So these are some of the beliefs and some of the privileges that might be coming in your direction when you hear these kind of ideas of you need to be in relationship to heal. I just don't see it that way. So what I was talking about earlier, and I think one of the reasons why so many people push for this is that relationships can provide triggers. Okay. And those triggers can be provided in a way that allows us to grow as human beings if we are willing to see them. Now, that's a big if. We're not, a lot of people don't see them. They go through relationship without ever even noticing the patterns or noticing the triggers they're experiencing. And they develop a relationship that avoids triggers and really, unfortunately, becomes quite stagnant because of that. But if we are willing to see the ways we are triggered in relationship, it can really be a powerful catalyst for growth. However, a very real scenario for complex trauma survivors, especially complex relational trauma survivors, is that the trauma in our relationships can become so severe and so significant that we dissociate and we repeat our traumatic patterns and we can't see that we're doing that. Okay. This is re-traumatizing and there is no growth that happens in this place. Many times we can't actually see those triggers until we get out of those relationships. Once we get out, we then can see like how significant the issues were. The reason we can't see these things is because when we were children, we put these blinders on, and these blinders were specifically to our traumatic patterns in our childhood. We had to start seeing the people in our families as okay. We had to justify and tell ourselves stories about what they were doing so that we could continue to live in that environment without falling into complete despair. It's actually a survival strategy to do that. The problem is then when we get into our adult relationships, we still have those blinders on, right? They're still there, or blinkers for those of you in the UK. So that can become a real problem for us because we get into relationships and when we start repeating our traumatic patterns, we can't see them. And if those traumatic patterns are extreme, we can end up in very scary, re-traumatizing situations. So what I would I'd like to kind of put a plug or just kind of mention the idea that triggers for us can happen in all kinds of relationships. And sometimes when we're on this healing journey, one of the best things we can do is back ourselves out of the most intense, most significant, like co-living, intimate types of relationships so that we can get our triggers on a slightly more surfacey level. Now, that said, if you have children, you are experiencing significant triggers and they are not surfacey because the kids, especially if the kids are young enough to where they're still living with you, there's nothing you can do about that. But obviously you can work on yourself and continue to see the triggers and keep pulling yourself out of those dissociative patterns as you see them. But a lot of times some of our best work, at least initially, is going to come from those less threatening, more surfacey relationships that we can get away from a little bit easier, a little bit better. So things like friends, coworkers, right? Even bosses to some degree can be a really not so unsafe place for us to start delving into relational patterns and seeing how they play out, learning how to set boundaries at places like work or with friendships can be honestly invaluable. Like these are some of our learning environments, coworkers, friendships. We're going to learn from them how to make sure we begin incorporating our own needs into relationships, how we can start setting those boundaries, which are like so difficult for us to set because we never got the chance. Um, and how we can start really connecting with ourselves while we're still connecting with someone else, right? Dropping the self-erasure. The more we do that in our friendships, which believe me, can be hard enough. I promise. I know this from personal experience. It can be hard enough just to do this in a friendship. But the more we practice it, the more we are moving ourselves in the direction of being able to do this in an intimate relationship or with our children, because those places are going to be the toughest for us. So if you're starting to really consider delving very, very deeply into your healing journey, I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that has to involve an intimate relationship for you. There will be times when you need isolation. There will be times when you can use relationships that are a bit less invasive to do your healing, and you're gonna need to be on your own. That is a part of the healing journey. Don't believe the hype when people say that if you're on your own, you don't have enough catalysts for healing. It isn't true. And if you have kids, you don't need anything else, if I'm honest. They are enough. I promise they are enough to bring everything to the surface. No doubt. Even if you have adult kids, it's still enough, right? So when you hear these kind of things, just kind of take them with a grain of salt and recognize that a lot of that advice is meant for people with maybe some mild relational trauma who can repeat those patterns and not actually put themselves at risk of not being safe. Okay. For those of us who can't do that because our relational patterns were that significant, it is okay to keep relationships not at the center of everything that we're doing right now in our lives, and make those a little bit more peripheral, a little bit more surfacey, so that we can address the big patterns before we try to bring somebody into our space, because we need them to be a safe person. And unless we've addressed the really extreme trauma patterns, they won't be. It won't be. Energetically, unconsciously, we're not going to bring those people into our space, safe people, until we've addressed the ways in which we experienced unsafe relational patterns. So that's what I have for you guys today. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, please do ask them. Thank you, Jan, so much. I'd love to hear if anybody has thoughts about this, because I'll be honest, this is a heavy topic for people. There's a lot of people with very strong opinions, as I said earlier, people who are coaching and training and doing therapy, but there's also just everyday people who will love to tell you that without relationship, you matter less somehow. And I'm not saying they say it that way, but that's the message they're giving, right? So a lot of people out there pushing us to be in relationship. And when the trauma is severe enough, that's a bad idea, right? That's my message for you today. But at the same time, I think really what I'm trying to get to is question things. Question what you're hearing, question how you're thinking about things, question where those thoughts came from, question where those thoughts came from in other people too, right? Like I said earlier, there can be a lot of privileges and a lot of beliefs that are tied to those thoughts. They aren't necessarily coming at you from a completely neutral perspective. That doesn't happen. So our job is to find that perspective mixed in with all of these other opinions about what is going to work for us. I will plan to talk to you guys next week, same time, same place. Thank you all so much for being here. I really enjoyed, yeah, Janice saying that was very deep. It was a little deep. I got a little deep. Um, but I just feel really, this is a very passionate topic for me. And I want to get it out there because it's not the common perspective. It just isn't. We don't hear it as much. So thank you all. And I will plan to talk to you next Tuesday, noon Eastern time. Talk to you then.